I was standing outside the venue in a dress I'd picked out 3 times before I got it right, holding a gift bag in one hand and $30,000 of my own money behind every single thing happening inside that building. My name was on the venue contract, my name was on the catering invoice, the florist paperwork, the baker's order form, even the ridiculous chair covers nobody would remember by morning. I hadn't asked for a toast, I hadn't asked to be thanked. I just wanted to sit in the back and watch my little brother marry the woman he said was the love of his life. Then she walked up to me in front of 2 guests and my own mother, looked me dead in the eye and said, "You don't belong here." She didn't lower her voice to say it. My brother stood 3 feet away and didn't say a word in my defense. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I walked to my car, sat down, opened my phone, and within 10 minutes I had cancelled every vendor tied to that wedding. Because here's a truth nobody in my family ever wanted to hear. You do not tell the person who paid for your entire day that she doesn't belong there and expect the day to still happen. My name is Renata Colby. I'm 37. I run a small tax and bookkeeping practice out of a converted house in Ohio. And for most of my life, I have been the responsible one in my family, which is a very different thing from being the loved one. My younger brother Owen was the son our whole household orbited. He wasn't especially hard-working or especially brilliant, but he was charming, and charm bought him a lifetime pass. When he forgot things, broke things, failed things, my mother had the same line ready every time. "He's just a boy, Renata. Let him be." I was 9 when Owen was born, and by the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, my role in the family had already been assigned to me without my consent. Be patient, be quiet, give way. "You're older, you should know better," was the phrase that raised me. I gave Owen the last cookie, the bigger half of every apology, the credit for things I'd done first, and I told myself that was simply how families worked. By high school, the gap between how we were treated had become impossible to ignore. I graduated with honours and a scholarship to a good university, and my parents barely made the ceremony. My father had work, my mother had a headache, Owen had a game. I sat in my cap and gown and told myself it didn't matter. It mattered more than I ever admitted out loud. After college, I built my life without asking my parents for a cent. 2 jobs, a studio apartment, eventually my own small firm. When Owen dropped out to find himself, nobody blinked. When he wrecked his car, my parents wired him $5,000 without a single question. I already knew why I never got that kind of help. I was the one they didn't have to worry about. And somewhere along the way, I'd learned that being reliable wasn't something you got celebrated for. It was something that made you invisible. Even my one serious relationship ended with a man named Trent telling me I was great, just not exciting. And that landed harder than he probably intended, because it confirmed the thing I'd always suspected, that giving everything and asking for nothing doesn't make you lovable, it makes you forgettable. Still, I kept showing up. I called my mother every week. I remembered birthdays. I helped Owen rewrite his resume when he got laid off. And when he told me he'd met someone named Diana, I genuinely tried to be happy for him. Diana worked in event coordination, was polished and always on her phone, and the first time we met, her eyes swept over me like she was pricing furniture. When they got engaged and admitted the wedding they wanted was way beyond what they could afford, I didn't hesitate. I told them to let me handle it. Venue, catering, flowers, photography, cake, all of it, my gift to them. Owen cried. My mother called me generous. For once, I felt like I'd stepped inside the circle instead of watching it from outside. I should have remembered that in my family, generosity was never returned. It was simply expected, and love went to whoever demanded it the loudest. I signed every contract myself, paid every deposit myself, and because a lifetime of being overlooked teaches you to protect yourself, had my lawyer add a clause to each one. No transfers, no third-party changes without my written approval. Owen thanked me with real tears in his eyes and told me he didn't know how he'd ever repay me. I told him he didn't have to, that I just wanted to see him happy. I meant every word. A week later, Diana called and asked me sweetly, almost too sweetly, to be her maid of honour. I said yes and threw myself into the role completely. Spreadsheets, mood boards, a paid makeup trial for the whole bridal party. She barely responded to any of it, and worse, I kept discovering she'd already made decisions behind my back. A photographer I hadn't chosen. A colour scheme that had quietly changed from lilac to blush with nobody telling me. When I dropped by their apartment unannounced one afternoon, Owen hesitated just a half second too long before opening the door, and Diana muted a video call and stood up too fast, too bright. Something was shifting, slow and cold, like a door closing while I was still standing in the room. I asked them both to meet me for coffee and asked plainly if something was wrong. Diana told me wedding planning was stressful and I shouldn't take anything personally. Owen told me not to stress, that I'd already done more than enough. I drove home with a heaviness in my chest I couldn't explain. A week later, I found out why. Diana posted a photo online, arm around another woman, captioned my maid of honour. Couldn't imagine this day without you. No call, no text, no warning. I'd simply been erased and the comments underneath were full of strangers congratulating a woman I'd never met for a title that had been mine days earlier. When I called Owen, he told me almost casually that Diana wanted someone who felt like a real best friend. Not just family, but that I was still invited, still had a seat. That word, seat, rang in my ears the rest of the night. When I told my mother the next day, she didn't even look up from her magazine. "Don't make this about you," she said. "It's her big day. Let it go." That was the moment I understood, fully and finally, that my job in this family had always been to give without complaint and disappear without thanks. 3 days later, an old friend named Josie called me, hesitant, apologetic. She'd seen Diana's wedding post and something had clicked for her. Did I remember Trent, the man I dated for 3 years before he ended things out of nowhere, claiming he'd simply fallen out of love? Josie had run into him with someone right after our breakup and hadn't put it together until now. She was almost certain that woman had been Diana. My mind flooded with details I'd buried. Trent's sudden secrecy, the name on his phone I never recognised, the strange composure Diana always carried like armour. She hadn't just cut me from the wedding out of preference. She had known exactly who I was from the very beginning, had let Owen introduce us, had let me fund her entire wedding while sitting on that knowledge the whole time. This wasn't carelessness. It was calculated. And once I understood that, I stopped being hurt and started being clear-headed. Next morning, a text came through from Diana's number, dressed in polite language that couldn't hide what it actually was. After discussion, she and Owen had decided to keep the wedding small, no extended family, and they hoped I'd understand. I texted Owen directly, "Is this true?" and got nothing back but a message marked red. Diana texted again, asking me not to bring unnecessary stress to the day. I answered with 5 words, "Then I'll play my part." I hung up, poured coffee, and pulled out the folder I'd built over months of planning. Every invoice, every contract, every deposit, all of it in my name and no one else's. I called the venue first and cancelled, calmly identifying myself as the sole contract holder and instructing that no one else was authorised to make changes. Then the caterer, then the florist, then the rental company, the photographer, the bakery. Nobody screamed. Nobody had to. By early afternoon, everything Diana and Owen had spent months curating had been quietly, surgically dismantled. Not out of rage, but out of the simple fact that it was never actually theirs to keep. The day before the wedding, my phone stayed silent, and I understood that silence wasn't peace, it was ignorance. They still didn't know. Owen found out first, standing at a locked gate where a confused groundskeeper told him the reservation had been cancelled days earlier. No tents, no trucks, no flowers, nothing. When he called Diana, she screamed loud enough that I imagined the whole building heard it. Every vendor she tried rang through to a disconnected line. Finally, my own mother called me, panicked, asking what I had done. I told her evenly to ask the people she'd chosen to defend instead of me. She threatened legal action, said Owen's lawyer cousin claimed I could be liable for damages. I told her I just emailed her the contracts, every single one in my name, never transferred because nobody had ever bothered to ask. They tried to cut me out of my own investment, I said, so I withdrew it. Guests were flying in for a wedding that no longer had a venue, a cake, or flowers, and there was nothing left for anyone to do but live with it. The ceremony that finally happened took place at the courthouse 2 days later. Folding chairs and fluorescent lights standing in for the glass ceiling to state that had once been booked. I wore navy, no makeup, no jewellery, and stood quietly at the back where I preferred to be. Diana's hair was pinned up in a rush, her smile forced. Owen looked pale and hollow. Midway, through the efficient script, my 72-year-old Aunt Marilyn stood up from the second row without raising her voice and asked the room plainly if no one was going to say anything. She told them she'd postponed a hip surgery for this wedding, bought a new dress, booked a hotel, and now they were all sitting in a courthouse because the bride and groom couldn't manage basic decency toward the woman who'd paid for everything. The room went still. I didn't add a single word. I didn't need to. The silence that followed said more than any speech could have. A teenage cousin had filmed the whole exchange, and by the following week it had been watched by millions of people online, my aunt's voice ringing out clearly over shaky phone audio, while Diana's face crumpled and Owen stared at his shoes. The comments were unanimous and merciless in my favour. Diana's social media turned into a battlefield until she made everything private, but the internet had already kept its receipts. Owen stopped showing up to work by that Thursday. I said nothing publicly the entire time. I didn't need to defend myself. The truth had already done that on its own. A month later, Owen showed up at my door, soaked from rain, and told me I'd been right about everything, that Diana had called me cold and controlling from the very start, had asked him to keep me out of the smaller gatherings, and that he'd been too afraid of losing her to push back. Then he told me something else. He'd seen a message on her tablet, still open, still warm with someone else's name in it, Trent, still in her life, still telling her he was the only one who really understood her. I asked Owen plainly if he'd have married her anyway, even knowing what he knew now. He didn't answer. He told me he hadn't come to be forgiven, only to say the truth out loud before I heard it from someone else, and then he left. Over coffee with Josie a few days later, I told her the truth as clearly as I understood it myself. I hadn't cancelled that wedding for revenge. I'd cancelled it because nobody had bothered to ask me why I'd walked away. They had simply assumed I would absorb it the way I always had. I told her I was done giving people the benefit of the doubt at my own expense, done making excuses for everyone but myself. When my mother texted a few weeks later asking for dinner, just the three of us, I read it once and set the phone down without replying. I already knew that dinner would come with an unspoken bill. My silence again in exchange for a seat at a table I'd spent my whole life trying to earn. That evening I drove out to a quiet park at the edge of town and walked the trails without any particular destination, listening to children laughing somewhere in the distance, watching the light turn gold through the trees. For years I had tried to be the daughter, the sister, the woman my family had already decided I was allowed to be. Standing there in that quiet, ordinary evening, I understood something I hadn't let myself believe before. I had never been the problem. I didn't need anyone's dinner invitation to prove that. I belonged to myself, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. Take a moment to comment your city or country. I love connecting with you all. Thank you for listening and supporting, and be sure to subscribe for more stories. More are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself and stay strong.